actually received one of the first grants from that program, and we have an uninterrupted success in getting grants. So it's a very important part of what we do. At the same time, as we all know, we are looking at a future that is less certain in terms of the continuation of these programs in the way that they have existed for a very long time. And there is some apprehension, both in terms of scholarship and institutionally, again, for places that depend so much on these programs for continuing these studies. So there is some apprehension. But at the same time, there is a sense, especially those of us who have been doing this for a long time, there's always these turning points and crises that we go through, and then something happens and we move beyond that. So there's a sense perhaps that this is a cyclical moment. There will be another event, a Sputnik or a 9/11 or something like that, that will once again remind people why learning about these places, knowing about these places is important. We personally don't think that this is a good way of approaching this, pivoting all the time. By the time you finish, you can end up being a modern dancer or something. So we are actually, what we all share on the panel is the long-term importance of doing area studies. And we'll talk about different aspects of this, why this is important, what contribution it has done to learning about this space, but also to understanding the U.S. interests and in the world and in bilateral relations with Russia and other countries. And also continuing, sort of looking into the future, what role these programs are likely to play in the coming years. We have a very distinguished group here who can speak to this from different perspectives. I will again introduce them very briefly, and they will speak for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. Our first speaker will be Steve Hansen. He is Vice Provost for International Affairs, Director of the Wendy and Emery Reeves Center for International Studies, and Letty Pate Evans Professor in the Department of Government at the College of William and Mary. Steve already has all these titles, but I also want to add that he was a professor at the University of Washington for more than 20 years, until a couple of years ago. And of all the people, perhaps next to Herb Ellison, he has played the biggest role in strengthening our Russian and Eastern European Studies Center, and I still think of him as my colleague. He is also a scholar who's published many articles and books on issues that have to do with Soviet politics and post-Soviet politics. We will then hear from Sam Eisen, who will give us a sense from the trenches, as it were. Sam Eisen is the director of the Language Flagship and Director of Programs at the National Security Education Program. And before coming to this position, he served as the director of the Advanced Training and Research Group in International and Foreign Language Education at the U.S. Department of Education. So he was very much at the center of Title VI programs for a long time, and we worked with him very closely over the years, and he is going to talk to us about what's going on, especially with the NSAP program. And last but not least, Angela Stent. She seems to have either taught or has known most of the people in this audience. And she is, of course, the director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European Studies and professor of government and foreign service at Georgetown University. Her publications and reputation is really too long for me to repeat here, but I just want to mention that last year we had the pleasure of hosting Professor Stent in Seattle, and while she was there for 1 week, she also had the title of Herb Ellison Distinguished Visiting Professor of Russian Studies. So I'm very pleased that my colleagues are here, so I'm going to ask Steve to start.
Thank you so much, Rashad, for that very nice introduction. It is indeed a a very special moment for me and a huge honor to be here as somebody who came into the field of Russian studies, which was then Soviet studies, in 1990. A very exciting time to join the profession. And I really can tell you honestly, had it not been for Herb Ellison being at the University of Washington to provide a role model of how to be a scholar, administrator, and teacher of this field at a time of transition or transformation or revolution or whatever we want to call it, I'm not sure I would have made it through because there were so many people who were abandoning the field or deciding their expertise was no longer relevant. And Herb, among many other great qualities, always knew that he was a Russianist. He was an historian of Russia. So he approached Soviet studies from that lens, and as a result, the transition for him was much less wrenching, and he remained committed to the same basic positions about the longer trends in Russian society, which I think would still be very relevant to us today. I think if he were here today, he would be immensely gratified to see this gathering and these excellent presentations. So on a very small scale, I'll see if I can contribute something. I also do want to just quickly mention that I've also been totally indebted over my career to the Jackson Foundation, the Jackson School, and the Kennan Institute. And so, again, it's a bit of an overwhelming feeling. Well, it's rare that I give a talk that's based on 10-year-old research. But today's the day to do it, because it just so happens that, along with a very illustrious co-author, one Blair Rubel, who I see sitting over there on the left, I had the opportunity to write a piece with Blair, which was on the future of Russian studies. And we wrote this in 2004 at the conference, which was sort of the inaugural conference of the Ellison Center, which we founded that year in 2005. Many people in the room, including Angela, were at the event. We gathered some 70 specialists in Russia from academia, from government, from NGOs, and from business. And we had a long discussion in 2004 at the Jackson School about where we thought Russian studies could go in the 21st century. And Blair and I then wrote up the results in a report which you can still download from the Jackson Foundation website. It's called Indispensable Knowledge: Rebuilding Russian Studies for the 21st Century. So, in preparation for these remarks, I thought it would make sense to go back and reread our work from nearly 10 years ago now and see how it stands up. And that's why I'm now going to deliver the same talk I gave in 2004. But everything old is new again, so you'll see that it turns out it's quite topical. In 2004, at that event, Blair and I and the group decided that there were, why was Russian studies so important after all? We wanted to ask, because you should ask the question. We shouldn't take it for granted. I think we have a line in the report: there is no big center in the United States for Madagascar studies. And nobody really in the room would probably mind too much. Of course, having said that, someone will be doing Madagascar here. So why is Russian studies really worth having a special center for, or a special program for? Why do we need federal funding for it? And we came up with 6 reasons why. The first is the obvious one, and it's geography. But worth stating, do we really want to have an international relations field that ignores up to 1/6 of the Earth's landed surface, with Russia and the former Soviet Union? Do we want to ignore a country that borders every single, practically, geopolitical zone of importance to American foreign policy that we can think of, whether that's North Korea, whether that's China, whether that's Southeast Asia, Afghanistan, obviously, Iran, Middle East, Western Europe, and the Arctic, as has been mentioned many times. And I'm happy to report that in our paper in 2004, we pointed out that the ice caps were melting. And that
They're still melting.
And they're still melting.
Ahead of the curve.
So we got that line in there. So here's a country that, just in the center of, in effect, our planet, its fate, regardless of what happens, can help and impinge upon geopolitical issues across the board in ways which we often do fail to recognize because we're not focusing on the Russian perspective on world affairs. I think it may have been something of a surprise to see that if you put missile defense, to guard against North Korea, it actually has an effect on Russian attitudes towards missile defense as well, which then impact Iran. And these are interconnections which come up sort of too late in our thinking about these kinds of foreign policy questions. So geography is an obvious factor. Second, we did have the nuclear arsenal in there. We thought it was important that we have a field that studies the country with the second largest arsenal of nuclear weapons and also weapons of mass destruction more generally. Of course, there has been substantial progress since then in reducing the numbers. Stars and New START has been signed. But as we see with the debates now about non-Lugar and increasing difficulties in the U.S.-Russian bilateral relationship over these issues of weapons of mass destruction and also missile defense, the importance of having experts who really can still follow issues of arms control with a technically trained expertise has not gone away. And in some ways, it's still really very much at the top of the agenda. Our third reason to study Russia was energy. It was oil and gas. We pointed out that Russia at that point was the second largest oil exporter after Saudi Arabia. Now maybe right around there still, and U.S. is creeping up, but hasn't changed much. Natural gas, yes, now there's fracking, and there's some real interesting questions about what the future of the Russian energy dominance in Eurasia will look like if fracking technology continues to spread, places like Ukraine. Having said that, energy is absolutely clearly crucial in the study of Russia, and vice versa. The study of world energy can't be done without Russian expertise. Our fourth reason had to do with the threats of Russian state weakness. We didn't say the threat of Russian military revanchism or anything like that, but we did point out that Russia's rather difficult situation with state corruption, with ability to control trafficking issues, whether those are drugs or people being trafficked, the conduit really of heroin supply from Afghanistan to Europe, which also hasn't gone away, and general issues of social instability, which can still matter in Russia, despite the fact that it looks like for the time being those have died down a little bit. So understanding that Russia is still a state in transformation, still a state in a way with a destination that's not totally known, is a reason to understand where Russia's headed, because if things went off the rails or went in a very wrong direction, this clearly would have incredibly important geopolitical consequences. Our fifth reason to study Russia had to do with the upside, that is the opportunities posed by a Russia that was rebounding economically in 2004. And we pointed out in the paper that the opportunities with globalization and the inclusion of Russia into the economic markets of the world would be something that would be extremely important for American investors, for American businesses and employment in the United States. And I think that's been borne out. We heard this morning from Travis Sullivan at Boeing about the specific opportunities in the aerospace sector, which we're also developing back then when we wrote. And the WTO accession obviously also makes very relevant the opportunities with Russia's rebound, the ninth biggest economy in the world, which I think very few Americans realize. I think most would probably, if you had to, do a poll, people would guess 120th, something like that. But it's actually one of the biggest in the world. And then finally, and we thought this was very significant, our sixth reason to study Russia was because of Russia's continuing contributions to world culture. And we thought it was worth emphasizing that a lot of us got into the field because of Russian culture. It's true for myself. It's reading Tolstoy and Dostoevsky or hearing Tchaikovsky or Stravinsky. It's that kind of immersion in the Russian way of thinking and the Russian worldview and all of Russia's greatness that got so many people hooked and kept us hooked. And it's not as if those cultural contributions, as we said in the paper, just stopped somehow in 1917 or in 1991. Those contributions of this brilliant, educated population continue to this day in spheres ranging from computer science and mathematics to geopolitical thinking. And again, given that world historical contribution, why wouldn't you want to have a field dedicated to the study of the continuing contributions of Russian culture and intellectuals? Well, when you really add up the 6 points, and it is the same talk, right? Would you like to have or not have a field devoted to the largest country in the world with a second largest nuclear arsenal, with one of the largest energy reserves, that could be very threatening if it breaks down, that has enormous opportunities if it continues to rebound, and that makes incredible contributions all the time to world culture? Yes or no?
Duh.
Right. The answer is pretty obvious. That was a rhetorical question. Having said that, we then had to come up with we're political scientists, actually, so we have a puzzle. And a puzzle requires a kind of theoretical explanation. We need some sort of variable that explains why there wouldn't be enormous interest in the United States and funding streams for this incredibly important field. And we had 3 reasons why. Again, they're still accurate. The first was the general decline of area studies. We saw in 2004 that after a decade or more of attacks on area specialists in academia as being out of touch with realities of the modern globalized world, as being too left-wing, some said, because critical of American foreign policy, too right-wing, others said, because too close to the Defense Department and other nefarious entities. It was interesting how both the left and right could only unite on one thing in the 90s. That was area studies was a bad idea. So we were in an environment where we were trying to rebuild Russian studies from the Soviet era that, had very little support from foundations or intellectuals for area studies as an enterprise. This was the heyday, after all, of the Washington Consensus, so-called, the notion that there was a kind of recipe for economic reform and for transition that could be applied across the board, that technology would make the study of culture irrelevant. Some of those strains are still with us, many have faded, but it definitely left its mark, and it made it difficult to get people to continue to pay attention to an area in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Second reason, of course, was the specific collapse of the Soviet Union and it's the bad taste in people's mouths after what were widely perceived to be the failures of Sovietology or the failures of Kremlinology. As a person who did enter the field in 1990, I still bear the scars of being a young scholar who was immediately sort of tarred with the brush of the failure to predict the collapse of the Soviet Union. There have been, by the way, a few predictive failures in U.S. financial circles of late, and so I guess maybe there's more than one failure out there to look at. But there was a notion in the 1990s that it was a specific problem of somehow the Russian studies field, that there was nobody who understood that Gorbachev could break the whole system down, that the whole field was taken completely by surprise. So then when you went back to funders or foundations or colleagues and said, we really need resources, other than my colleagues at the UW, of course. But most people were very skeptical of the idea they should be reinvesting in a field that seemed to be such a spectacular failure. And then the third reason we really looked at for the difficulty in rebuilding Russian studies had to do with Russia's unique kind of geopolitical identity, in a way, a country that's hard to characterize. We don't still really have a good name for the field as a whole. Russian studies works easily enough, but if we talk about the broader region, I will actually next year be the president of something called the Association of Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies, ASIS, although some people say ASIS. We're still stuck, because we can't come up with a moniker or an acronym for this. Most people now really say post-Soviet space. Even in Russia, people say постсоветское пространство. It's not really that, emotionally satisfying somehow to have the 20 years later, the post-Soviet space as the way that we speak about an entire world region. But beyond just the issues of nomenclature, the deeper problem is that Russia doesn't fit into some kind of very standard academic paradigms which allow us to categorize world states effectively. It doesn't fit easily into European studies, although it is a European power, because European studies has become almost totally dominated by study of the European Union. And it doesn't fit very easily into post-colonial studies, even though many of its issues are related to those of the developing world, because it is, after all, a former superpower, an imperial core, not a third world country. It doesn't fit well into Asian studies, as we've already discussed, because although it is of Asia and crucial in Asia, it's not Asian, and very few Russians would identify themselves as Asian. And that matters because when you go, again, to foundations and others to try to get support, people say, well, why would we study? We got a Europe studies place, we've got an Asia studies place, and we're doing some, global South issues these days, but what is this kind of post-Soviet thing? So those were the reasons we basically came up with for trying to explain why we weren't doing the obvious thing in sustaining Russian studies. Well, I know time is very short, so I want to fast forward now to the new decade. Our conclusion in the paper, by the way, in 2004 was that since we wouldn't expect academics to rally around Russian studies for the reasons just mentioned, we wouldn't expect foundations really to be the lead drivers because of their internal debates about area studies in general and Eurasian studies in particular. We wouldn't really expect the corporate community to take the lead because their interests are too diverse to really coalesce around giant funding streams for academics. We thought the only way forward was robust federal funding for Russian studies, building on the great programs which are still in place, Title VI, Title VIII, Department of Defense programs, Fulbright, and so forth. Well, here we are today looking at massive cuts in Title VI, nearly half the budget cut in one of the first deals to keep the government open over the last few years. We're looking at big struggles over the funding for Title VIII in the State Department that we're very grateful for the support of many people in the room who've helped to keep that going. That does help Kennan Institute. It helps National Council. It helps a wide range of research going on in the field right now in Eurasia, and otherwise that research won't be funded in the same way. With sequestration, who knows what will happen in all sorts of other aspects of federal funding from Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and so on, which have kept the field afloat. And without the continuation of the federal funding, all the other factors that we mentioned back in 2004 or 5 are still very much in place. And so the forecast looks a little bleaker. So let me try to conclude not on such a bleak note, but on a more optimistic one. We are now in an era of globalization, and that at least everybody understands. There's really nobody the game of debating what the new phrase is for the 21st century is over. It's not clash of civilizations. It's not end of history. It is, in fact, globalization, and that's one. That's great, because it's true. What does globalization mean, though, for us as analysts? And everyone in this room is an analyst in one way or another. It means that all 193 countries in the United Nations, and maybe the 7 or so non-recognized parts of the world that we could talk about, they all matter. There are only 200 or so entities, if you really think about it, that we can trace from a country basis. And that's not that hard when we think about the fact that many of us who grew up in the United States memorized all 50 states of the United States by the time we were 7 years old. All 50 states, and often all 50 capitals. And often 50 state mottos. I did that in school. We had 150 bits of information in our head at the age of 7. So 200, we're past graduate school now, right? This matters a lot. Imagine you went to a cocktail party somewhere in D.C. and you talked to somebody. You said, I'm from the state of Iowa. Someone said, Iowa? Never heard of Iowa. So what a funny sounding name, Iowa. You would sound crazy, right, if you said something like that at a cocktail party. But if you say Kyrgyzstan, never heard of Kyrgyzstan. How do you put Z and an S and a stan? Then everyone says, ha, ha, ha. No one thinks it's weird. No one thinks it's sort of depressing that you don't know about Kyrgyzstan. People think that's funny. That's the shift that the 21st century is going to make. And I mean it. By the time the next generation are in positions of power, everyone will know where Kyrgyzstan is and all other 200 bits of information I just mentioned. And it'll be crazy to have someone at the party who doesn't know any of them, Gabon or Madagascar or Portugal or wherever. So in that context, there is hope. The hope is that as the generation that's coming into places like William and Mary and University of Washington right now, who are desperate for global experience, who are engaged in global knowledge, who know that that's the future of their own careers, are asking, how does Russia fit into the world? Along with all the other regions, those 6 great reasons to have Russian studies continue will be obvious to that next generation. They won't be able to imagine a world in which we don't study a sixth of the planet because they're studying the entire planet. But we have to get that message across in a hurry, because otherwise we're in danger of losing a lot of expertise that it'll be difficult to rebuild. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sam?
Thank you. It really is a pleasure to be here and to have been invited here and to reconnect with Russian roots. I'm a INR Title VIII alum many years back, and was in language and literature until joining the government almost 15 years ago now, and have really sort of gone global rather than sticking with the Russian and East Europe. I hedged my bets a little bit. I'm guilty of that. I was getting, this fall I started getting panicked phone calls from the field saying, is Russian off the list? I mean, and my only response could be, well, we're still doing Russian, and we still need Russian. I think a lot of programs were concerned that Russian language, Russian studies would just, fall off the earth. I think, if just to say, and this is just my opinion, this is not an official statement at all. I think the Russian field has been strong over time. I think it's been funded over time, and I think compared with other languages and other regions, there isn't quite as much of a shortage of expertise. There are a lot of Russian experts, and there are a lot of very good Russian experts, and I really do think it's a credit to the field overall. But it's clear that we need to understand Russia, that Russia, as pointed out this morning, plays a role not only with Eurasia, but writ large with the West, with the East, and needs to be studied and understood. So that much is clear. We already did that. I'm with the Defense Language and National Security Education Office. NSEP, National Security Education Program, was merged with the Defense Language Office a year ago, and it's been kind of a fascinating synergy because NSEP has a broad federal mission, obviously. Defense Language Office is a defense unit, but it looks at the largest chunk of language and cultural and regional expertise need in the federal government. So we really have a view into what's needed across the federal government. And we have the National Security Education Board that includes 7 agencies, including education and state, that gives us perspective on what's needed throughout the federal government. And coming from Title VI, I was at Title VI at Department of Education and moved to Department of Defense. What's fascinating about the NCEP mission, and it really is a unique and interesting place to be, is that we combine 3 things that aren't necessarily usually combined. One is the federal concern with increasing the pipeline of qualified international specialists, qualified people with language for the federal government. But that's combined with a mission to work with higher education, to partner with higher education, to improve higher education, and it's combined with an advocacy mission, meaning that we can actually speak out in favor of language and the importance of regional studies. Probably more for our board than for me personally to, we can't lobby, but we can certainly speak on behalf of our office, and we engage with states and local education agencies to talk about the importance of this for the country. So I'm going to talk about 3 of the programs we have, all of which have strong Russian components, and talk about how we're looking at changing the field and integrating the academic enterprise with career pathways, and really getting to what deans are facing these days. Among the things that deans, provost chancellors, and presidents of universities are facing is this challenge of show me your results in terms of career path, and show me your metrics, and show me your assessment. And frankly, the Title VI program also faced these questions. While I was there, we were talking about how do we show results on FLAS and other programs. So it's endemic throughout the higher education enterprise, and critical. So I'm going to talk about the language flagship experiment. I'm going to talk a little bit about Boren Awards, and I'm going to talk about our relationships with ROTC and the ROTC Project Go program. The language flagship is about 10 years old. The core experiment now is about 6 years old, which is to transform undergraduate education. We've got 26 programs at 22 institutions, teaching 10 strategic languages. And what we're doing is raising the bar way up on the type of language proficiency, not just speaking, but reading, listening, writing, the type of language proficiency that we want undergraduates to achieve in foreign languages and strategic languages. Our biggest programs are obviously Chinese is the biggest with 11 of the 26 programs. We've got 6 Arabic now and 4 Russian, and then a number of what we call the Singles Club one-off programs in Korean, Hindi, Urdu, Turkish, Swahili. And what we're doing is saying, well, the language and literature model, which I come out of, is one model, but what we want is to be able to integrate language learning across the disciplines, into social science, into the professional disciplines, into business, law, probably not law at an undergraduate level so much. And we're creating a pool of college graduates from all majors with professional proficiency. So that's measured in the government, that's measured at Interagency Language Roundtable 3 as the goal to get to for professional proficiency. It's ACTFL Superior. And we're creating global professionals. So it's really intensifying the domestic curriculum. And frankly, one of the most radical ideas out there is American undergraduates can actually do this. And if you challenge them, yes, some will drop out, but you know what? If you challenge the good ones, they will rise to the challenge. And they do, and they're very excited about it. We have kind of a dual model, and a domestic and overseas model. What we do is we train, these are just our Russian partners. We have, the other Chinese and Arabic partners. I'm just showing the Russian for this group. Those are our domestic flagships. And what we do is we have intensive training where we get them up to an advanced level of language in their domestic program. They major in any major. We try to provide in ways we can study in the target language, so study in Russian in disciplinary fields. So they take history, or if they're scientists, maybe they may have to work with a language partner or a professor who happens to be from Russia in that field, in that language. And we make sure that they're fully ready to go into a foreign university, in this case St. Petersburg State University, and take a course in Russian with Russian students, that they're able to perform in an internship in a Russian organization and get ready to make that leap from advanced language skill, which is, in a good language program in the U.S., an undergraduate major in language and literature will reach that level, and to take them up to kind of the ILR3 gold standard of what what agencies who deal with high-level analysts would want in a high-level analyst, and we're taking them up to that level. Not that they all. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you just give us a sense of the dollar amount that's going to that?
Yeah, it's well.
And also how many students are involved?
Yes, I can. I didn't give all the slides. The cost per student at this point is about, I think it's about $12,000 per year, but that's a multi-year thing. So it's about $12,000 per year. So a student who does 4 or 5 years of the program, it'll be an investment of about $60,000, which compares favorably, very favorably, to other government training programs that would get someone to an ILR3 level. And the enrollment, we have about 1,000 undergraduates across the 26 programs. I don't remember the individual enrollments at the programs. I can tell you that the overseas output of students, so from these 4 institutions, we get about 20 students per year now who are qualifying at the advanced level, fully ready to engage in a very rigorous program. So, 4 or 5 per institution per year.
Is there a competitive process to choose these institutions, or is it kind of just geographic diversity?
No, we do competitions, but we do them rarely because we generally, once someone's in, if they're performing, we generally keep them in, and we only have limited options for competitions. We ran an Arabic competition this summer. If we have funding, we may run another Chinese or Persian competition, something like that. So what's happening at these institutions is fascinating. When Portland State came on, people were kind of like, oh, that's not one of the Russian powerhouses. What's going on there? What's going on at Portland State is incredible. They've got a very non-traditional student population, mostly older students, not on-campus model. And what they're doing is integrating heritage and non-heritage learners together. And they've integrated Russian language into the whole curriculum. These students are taking gen ed requirements, at least partially, like 2 credits in Russian, 2 credits in English. They've integrated the gen ed program to be a higher level target language piece of the program, plus other types of content and very intensive proficiency-based Russian language. These students are great candidates for our Boren Awards and other things, and they're going great guns. Each of these is very, very different institution. UCLA is focusing, with Olga Kagan, focusing on how to teach to heritage learners, to really to get those heritage kids who sound beautiful, but don't have the grammar to be able to parse an article, and to get them to be high professionals. And working with her and Dan Davidson at American Councils, who manages our overseas program, getting them not only to the superior level, but to the distinguished ILR4, which is very near native proficiency. At Wisconsin-Madison, what we're finding, again, very different program model, and integrated with a graduate program in a different way. What we're finding is the undergrads are challenging the grad students to push harder, because the undergraduate language requirements are actually higher than some of the graduate language requirements. And they're pushing the program up. And when these kids get to graduate programs, you're not going to have to do any kind of remediation. They're going to be ready to go. I'll try to go more quickly. So they do internship experiences in St. Petersburg. Look at the kinds of organizations. Now, these are kids who are basically approaching a professional level. So they're doing professional work at Chamber of Commerce and Industry, several media centers, a newspaper, Nevskaya Vremya, a women's crisis center, an ecological center, a social research center. You can be any major, so someone went to an architecture studio. But this is someone who's ready to interact with Russian peers professionally at a very comfortable level. So when they come back, they've really got skills to sell. Here are our speaking proficiency results. I just recycled the slide from a prior presentation, so I didn't delete Arabic and Chinese. But the tall green towers are basically 100% of Russian students reaching the professional proficiency after the St. Petersburg experience, as compared to about 62% of the Arabic and 56% of the Chinese. Now, granted, according to some measures, Arabic and Chinese are even higher intensive Category 4 languages, whereas Russian is called a Category 3 language. I think some people dispute this. But I think what it's showing is that the St. Petersburg model, which is very mature, is really working. So that's what we're doing with Language Flagship, and it's high expectations, proficiency, assessment, and integration with disciplines and career goals. And that's what we're shooting for. The Boren Awards is a national scholarship and fellowship competition. I'm sure you're familiar with it, providing funding for students to do long-term study overseas in less studied areas. 1 year of federal government service is required after the award. And then we have a shop in our office that tries to place all these people, which is getting challenging with hiring freezes and all, but these students do very well. We've got a nice trickle of, let's say, stream of Russian language Boren grads going into government. These are our placements over the last 5 years. 39 into Department of Defense, 35 into Department of State, could be USAID, 8 at Department of Homeland Security, 4 specifically in the intelligence agencies, although some of the DoD people may wear intelligence hats as well, 13 in other federal government agencies. And if you can't find a job in the federal government and can find a job in education, we'll grant service for teaching in your field, and we've got 11 in education. So, that's it. Are these students needed in state and defense? Yes, and they're getting hired, and they're getting really interesting jobs. The other thing that's really ballooning is our cooperation with ROTC. And this is a major shift, because ROTC is really taking culture and language seriously now. And we're ramping up the language requirements in this Project Go program. So what happens is ROTC officers get a summer immersion. They take language, they get a summer immersion. They're trying to get at least up to intermediate levels of language, so that our officers who commission have actually had an overseas experience, some serious language study, and are really prepared to be this concept of a global officer. And we're getting big numbers. If you can see, I don't know if you can see, that's all of our Project Go programs, and then the diamonds are where the Russian programs are located, the ones that also teach Russian, although ROTC students from all over the country can apply. I'll just quickly finish up with the numbers. So we've got about 100 a year now, future officers getting serious cultural immersion with Russian. And this is our list of Project Go sponsored programs who teach Russian. It's a good list. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Angela?
Thank you very much. And let me say, we've obviously had students who've been the beneficiaries of the Borum program, and it's a terrific program. Thank you very much, the organizers, for asking me to speak here. It's an honor again to speak at a symposium in honor of Herbert Ellison. I did know him. I did work with him. I think he edited a book in which I have a chapter, and I did work with him on a documentary series on the end of the Cold War he produced called Messengers from Moscow. And I will tell you, I think it's still the best documentary about the end of the Cold War. I still show it to my students, even though it's now nearly 20 years old. So he was really the epitome of the best in Russian studies. I guess I would describe myself as a recovering Sovietologist. That's my generation. And one other point on this, I remember vividly a conference at the Kennan Institute shortly after the Soviet Union collapsed, when we had John Mearsheimer, one of the enfants terribles, he's not an enfant anymore, of the political science field, accuse us all, as Sovietologists, of not, foreseeing what happened to the Soviet Union. And one of the arguments me made was, well, the leaders didn't foresee it either. And I'm sure Mr. Gorbachev didn't foresee it until very near the collapse. So,
Angela, I just have to add that John Mearsheimer a couple years later wrote an article predicting that Ukraine would never give up its nuclear weapons.
Right, exactly. So, powers of prediction. Anyway, I'm going to do something a little different in my 10 minutes, and that is to give an overview of the U.S.-Russian relationship over the last 20 years and then relate it to the importance of area studies and the importance of needing to continue to train people to understand Russia, to understand the language and the culture. So if you look at the last 20 years of U.S.-Russian relations, you will see that 4 successive, it's more than 20 years now, U.S. presidents, beginning with George H.W. Bush, Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama, have all, at the beginning of their presidencies, in Bush 41's case, it was the end of his, believed that they could create a much improved and a much different U.S.-Russian relationship, that there was some kind of key to unlock to a qualitatively different relationship. And in all cases, although the jury is still out on the second Obama administration, they have ended up disappointed. Now, I discussed this issue with a former senior Russian official who worked both for Yeltsin and for Putin, and surprisingly, he said to me, both these people, they came into office and they wanted a breakthrough in U.S.-Russian relations, and they were both very disappointed. So there's some symmetry here, which is interesting, but clearly we have seen these ups and downs, these cycles in U.S.-Russian relations. Now, I just want to mention 6 areas where I think for the past 20 years there's been this consistent U.S.-Russian engagement. I would also say that if you look at the record, there's a lot more continuity in the policies of Republican and Democratic administrations, even though people don't like to admit that, because the presidential inbox, the State Department's inbox, the DOD's inbox, the issues that they face are always the same issues. And they make progress on some, and they fail to make make progress on others. And in these 6 issues, you'll notice I'm not going to include economics. Now, I thought the first panel was very interesting. It's very encouraging what Boeing and some other U.S. companies are doing. But I would just caution you that I think it's less than 1% of our total trade is with Russia. It could go up, could double as a result of WTO membership for Russia. That's maybe 2%. And that we do not have complementary economies. Unlike China and Russia, we've heard about that. Unlike Europe and Russia, the things that Russia sells mainly, exports, energy, and arms, we don't need. We're not going to buy. So we can have interesting economic relations in some compartmented fields, if you like, but this is not an area where we're going to see some huge breakthrough, irrespective of the politics, by the way. So the 6 issues, and these are all issues which are very complicated and where, again, you really need expertise on Russia, on understanding Russia, and on the possibilities. What have the 6 sets of issues been? The first has obviously been the nuclear legacy, and that is what still tends to dominate our relationship. It's one of the reasons why it's hard to move forward to a qualitatively different relationship, because we remain the 2 nuclear superpowers, and there you have obviously arms control, where we have had some success, the U.S. and Russia, and then issues such as missile defense, where it's been much, much more difficult to achieve any agreements. The second set of issues, it's related to the first, is non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and obviously the focus has been here on Iran, and to some extent also on North Korea. I mean, we're very aware of the North Korean issue at the moment. The third issue has been Russia's neighborhood. I'm not going to reiterate what Steve said. It's a little strange that more than 20 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, we don't really have a way of describing this area. Post-Soviet space, well, it implies a thing that unites them as their Soviet legacy. I mean, which it does. But, you know, Eurasia. But then Ukrainians say to me, we're not Eurasians, we're Europeans. So whatever we call it, Russia's neighborhood. And that has been a constant issue between the U.S. and Russia, and it obviously has to do with what the U.S. views as its legitimate role in that area, and of course what Russia views as its legitimate role in its, as described by Medvedev and Putin, sphere of privileged interests. The fourth set of issues, again, related to the third, is the whole gamut of European security. In the 90s, it was the Balkans, where we and the Russians did cooperate, but we also had major differences. It is the whole question of the future Euro-Atlantic security architecture. We've had several proposals from Medvedev. Now I think there's going to be another proposal from the Putin administration soon. But that comes back to a fundamental flaw of the 1990s, which was when we as the United States, I think, failed to think about an inclusive system where Russia would have had a role to play in this Euro-Atlantic system, as opposed to having it be a sort of tentative, a candidate member of some of these organizations, if you like to use the communist terminology, and therefore Russia has charted its own path there. Most recently, the fifth set of issues has had to do with the upheavals in the Arab world, and our view and the Russians' view of what should happen there, how we should deal with these governments. Obviously, at the moment, we're most preoccupied with what's happening in Syria. And then the sixth set of issues, and it comes back to things that were discussed in this morning's panel, and it runs through all of our discussions, is the question of Russia's domestic evolution and the U.S. role in the internal Russian system. In the 90s, there was obviously a lot of focus on Chechnya and the North Caucasus. That's receded somewhat, although the North Caucasus is still obviously a very fragile and volatile region. And of course, it has to do with a whole gamut of democracy promotion, human rights promotion, all of these kinds of questions. And we're very aware today, again, we heard this morning from the panel about the current clampdown on U.S. and, of course, European NGOs in Russia. So this is it's a long menu. It's a very challenging menu. It continues to demand both sides' attention. And you know, we're in this strange position where Russia is no longer our antagonist. It's not an enemy, but it's also not an ally. It's a partner. It's a limited partner, if you like. It can sometimes be a very difficult partner from our point of view, and surely from the Russian point of view too. But in order to calibrate and to formulate effective policies, you do need to have a very deep understanding of the history, the culture, and the way that Russia views the outside world. Now, what we've seen in the past 20 years also, and I'm just going to throw this out, we can't have a debate about it now, we don't have enough time, is where cooperation with Russia has worked best, things like arms control, Afghanistan, that's probably the most promising area at the moment where we're cooperating on the Northern Distribution Network. We also have now a NATO transit hub in Ulyanovsk, the birthplace of Vladimir Lenin, for those of you that don't know that, and that's quite a change too. I mean, if you think back to the Cold War. Cooperation on Iran to some extent. Where the cooperation works best is when we really do both believe that we share interests. Where it works least and where it's most difficult is when you come to the question of issues that have to do with values. Now, I should also emphasize that you can't really separate interests and values completely. Every country, people, you define your interests in terms of your own values. But there clearly is a values gap. And the most difficult part of the relationship involves dealing with that values gap while we try and we do successfully pursue agreements that have to do with our common interests. One thing, and again, to come back to some of the things that have been said before, when you think about the U.S. approaching Russia and understanding how best to deal with Russia, a number of years ago, a very senior German official, actually at a conference at CSIS, former official, accused the United States of having empathy deficit disorder when it came to dealing with Russia. And the point was, you Americans, you think everything's going to change so quickly. You have to calibrate your policy toward Russia to design it while understanding Russia's peculiar sensibilities, its, if you like, obsession with kind of believing that the United States is maybe out to undermine it, its post-imperial hangovers, whatever you want to call this complex of issues that we hear emanating from Russia today and we have for the past 20 years, and accusing the United States of not being sympathetic or sensitive enough to that and not being willing to take these things into account. You know, as opposed to the U.S. attitude to the Russians, you got to get over it, right? It's over, communism's over, you were a superpower, you're not one anymore, let's move on. You know, we tend to give them the message sometimes, and that's maybe not the best way to deal with them. So again, I throw this out. I don't think there's any way of resolving it, but it comes back again to the question of the need really for understanding and appreciating how the Russians view the world. And I think we as Americans are not always very good, because we are a superpower still, of sort of standing back and putting ourselves in the shoes of other countries with which we're dealing and trying to understand how they see the world. Now, having said that, there is an ongoing debate, obviously, in the United States about how much we should focus on, if you like, the value side of the relationship with Russia. Should we be involved in issues of democracy and human rights promotion, or should we step back and say, this is the Russia that we're dealing with, we have concrete interests where we have to work together, and we are working together, and we should maybe step back from that? I'm not going to answer that. It's a very contentious issue. But I think if you look back over 20 years, you do have to ask yourself, what have we managed to achieve in terms of trying to promote more democracy and human rights in Russia? And I think it's a debate that, we haven't really had. But I would also say that, within the United States, public opinion, has soured on Russia. If you look at the Congress particularly, again, not to reiterate and go over the Magnitsky issues, but there really isn't very much sympathy or desire there, and particularly in the legislative branch, to reassess the relationship with Russia and to take actions that would promote a more productive relationship. So I don't really see, and now I'm going to come on to the area studies part, I don't really see in the next few years that there will be any breakthroughs in U.S.-Russian relations. I think the Obama administration achieved quite a lot of what it wanted to in its first administration, and the things that it didn't succeed in achieving, which have to do with missile defense and some other issues, it's probably we will continue to negotiate with the Russians. I would say that you have to believe that things are possible, otherwise you can't move forward. I would also say over the past 20 years, we've had some people running Russia policy who've been great experts in Russia. And so you can't only argue that, having a deep understanding of the language and culture guarantees you success, right? But without that, you're certainly not going to have much success, and I'm certainly not going to discuss individuals here. So my last point, and now I want to come back to the area study. So you can clearly see that I believe it's absolutely essential to continue funding programs that encourage students, undergraduates, graduate students to learn, in this case, Russian, or if we were talking about Central Asia, obviously the languages of Central Asia, the language, the culture, the history, to understand the politics of it. And Steve mentioned this. There has been an assault from academia on area studies for at least 20 years. The kind of dissertation that I wrote in the program I had as an undergraduate and a graduate student, you couldn't do anymore, nor would I get a job anymore in a political science department because, I don't do regression analyses, I don't do mathematical models, I don't feed things into a computer. So I'm going to leave the academic side of this out, but I am going to come back to the U.S. government because that was the other thing that Steve mentioned, when we had this great conference that Stephen Blair organized a decade ago. That's where, you certainly were looking to the government. Now, what's happened? There has been, in my opinion, a lethal combination of, things that happen in the legislative branch, in the Congress, where people don't see why we should be funding international education anymore. And we've had this 50% cut in the Title VI program. The Georgetown program is a little younger than the University of Washington. Our program started in 1959, but it's still a pretty old program. We've only been a Title VI center for the last 13 years. But anyway, so the threat from the Congress and then from the Department of Education. And I regret to say the current policy is that the money that's there should be given to underserved populations. Now, I have no disagreement with that. Of course, we should be supporting underserved populations. But why the cut for supporting centers of excellence, Title VI centers, supporting the language and cultures of all of these different regions, why that has to come, that's at the expense, of underserved populations, or why giving money to underserved populations means that they're not going to support these crucial area studies programs anymore. I don't understand. I was having a discussion with Sam beforehand. I understand some of it, but I lament it. So what we face in the next few years is the possibility that there will be no more Title VI programs, that the whole support of area studies will go away. The FLAS, the Foreign Language Fellowships, probably will continue, which is great because that provides scholarships and language training for students. But the rest of it may go away, and we may not have, in 10 years' time, we may not be able to train anymore the resources to train young people who have the expertise that then can go into the U.S. government, can serve on the National Security Council, can be in the State Department, and provide really good policy advice. And my final point on this is to look at Russia and say, it would be good if the Russians had their own Title VI program, if they use some of their oil money, because they too don't have a younger generation of Russians that understand the United States, that are trained in American studies. Most of us are dealing with the same people that we've been dealing with for 25, 30 years. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I noticed since this morning, each panel had this nice combination of pessimism and optimism in terms of U.S.-Russia relations, and here Russian studies, area studies in general. So these are very important issues that our panelists raised. We have about 15 minutes for questions and discussion, so I will start taking questions. Yes.
Hello, my name is Jason Joe. I'm with the Public Affairs Council here in Washington, D.C., and also a very proud alumnus of the Jackson School and the Ellison Center, and also a very grateful former student of Stephen Hansen. I have a lot to say from the student perspective, from the alumnus perspective, and I'll try to keep my comments and my questions short. But first, I received a wonderful education from the Ellison Center. Very proud of that. Second, the U.S. government invested quite a bit in my education. I received the Fussell Fellowship right out of undergraduate. I received the FLAS funding for 3 years. But I have this growing concern in this discussion that we're putting the cart in front of the horse a little bit. And I'll tell you why. Because despite getting all that investment from the U.S. government, I couldn't get a job with the U.S. government. And I applied to four of those agencies that are up there, and was proactively sought out for some. And it's not for lack of credentials, because I got that investment from the U.S. government in the first place, and I think I was a fairly decent student. Steve can maybe attest to that. But I'm growing concerned that there just aren't any jobs in the U.S. government, and it's not a complaint. I'm in the private sector now, and but if I had the choice, I'd be working for my country. Now, the irony, though, is that when I was finishing up my graduate schooling, I got a fellowship sponsored by a Russian organization, Alpha Bank, to go to Moscow and work at a Russian organization. And the Alpha Fellowship is a fellowship that was founded about 10 years ago by Mikhail Friedman and Peter Avin, because they're growing concerned that Americans don't have enough experience in Russia, and so they want more Americans with experience in Russia working in business. And that's where I work now. But it is a puzzle, and it's something that I just think it's a very important discussion. But again, with the U.S. government, I'm just wondering where is this going?
Okay, so Sam, why doesn't he have a job at the U.S. government?
Well, there are lots of things that happen. I mean, I should say that the Boren awardees have an advantage because they're special hiring authorities. It's easier for to be hired. If you commit to the service requirement, we actually help you get in. But I mean, I think we're working eventually with business, but also with government. Part of what our service team does, and we have a very, very experienced human resources professional who is now in our office helping out with this question. Part of what we're doing also is building demand and understanding within government offices for what someone with the right training can do. We're trying to build, what we're trying to do is, in fact, build demand and supply at the same time. Because yes, there are language-coded positions at specific agencies, but they're very few. But what we're finding is that when folks such as yourself get into these jobs, the demand grows, and then they come back to our service team and say, I'd like 10 more of those. But it is a process, and getting a federal job is from kind of from the outside is always difficult. But I think the same needs to be true of industry. And what I just like to say is that academia and industry kind of need to work together, and I think you have to be able to present your product to interested companies in a way that they understand, which means that I think there's a career focus that frankly just has to be integrated. I mean, I had no training to be a government person. I was a literature person. It's hard. It can be hard to make that transition. And you got the right kind of internship, and you've obviously done well. But the government jobs are a little tight right now, to say the least. I think as we see a wave of retirements, it will be cyclical.
Okay, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take about 4 or 5 questions, and then we'll go around the panel, and then we'll address them.
Blair Ripple, I actually have a comment on that last question, and I'll be provocative about it. I think Russian studies was in some ways deformed by the Cold War. There was an expectation that you learned your Russian and there was a job at the end. There are many, many aspects of life where that's not the case. There are many people who become highly trained professionals, say, in theater. They have no jobs. In music, they have no jobs. If you learned Italian, would you really expect that there would be a job waiting for you? There's a distinction that never developed in our field that is very important for a lot of people in other fields. You learn an area because there's a passion about it. And you may not have a life in the theater, but you can have a life of the theater. You can have a life of Russia. And you don't need necessarily the guaranteed job to justify the investment. And if that's why you're doing it, you are going to be disappointed because there aren't going to be enough jobs for all the people who want to actually make the effort to study Russia. But in the Cold War, or the original Title VIII vision, there was a conveyor belt. They went from undergraduate through graduate school, through early postdoc, to tenured faculty. There was even an effort in the original bill to create jobs. And there was an expectation that you would study Russia and there would be the great job for you at the end. There's no field where you have to make a high level of professional investment where that's the case anymore. And I think that's one way in which the world has changed since we did the report, Steve.
Thank you very much. I'm seeing a similar kind of development in Arabic now. There is this kind of similar expectation, but very interesting. Yes, please. Yes.
Eric England from the Naval Academy, and I've noticed that despite advances in technology and access to information, it would seem that on a national level, we have a severe lack of knowledge about contemporary Russia, as well as the world in general, which you alluded to with the Kyrgyzstan comment. And how do you propose that we spur interest in the field of Russian area studies for the upcoming generations so we can sort of combat at an earlier age this empathy deficit disorder that Ms. Sen was alluding to earlier? How do we get them at an earlier age?
Thank you for keeping the question short too. Yes, please. Yes.
Mary Kruger. I am also one of the people who studied under Dr. Ellison. However, I left Seattle immediately after graduation and I did find a job, but it wasn't easy. It was the same thing in the old days with the Foreign Service, and recently completed a fairly long career with the Foreign Service. I'd like to make a couple of comments. Number one, the Foreign Service is still hiring. It still needs people who have this expertise, but of course it is highly, highly competitive. It's not easy to get in. Secondly, one of the things that I saw over my career was how foreign policy is formulated. And it's not just experts who give advice. I think we've all seen how domestic American politics has caused a wellspring of feeling to take certain foreign policy actions that perhaps experts wouldn't necessarily recommend. And so I think there's a really important role here for people who are teaching young people, to teach them about the world and to teach them the fact that not everyone sees things as we do. The last comment I'd make about globalization, I think we all realize that globalization is the future. The only thing that I would worry about there is that perhaps there could be a tendency that young people would think that, well, yes, it'll be globalized world, but everybody's going to speak English. And if they don't speak English, I can use my Google Translator. So I really don't have to study other countries. So I think it's so important to learn about different mindsets, and congratulate you for doing that.
Yes, please.
Jordan Harms from the Heritage Foundation, and actually a future student for Georgetown University. So, so this question goes to Angela Stent. You mentioned about you talked at length about the future of area studies. All of you did, but my question goes to Angela Stent. Do you think where do you think the future careers lie in the field, in the government, especially for someone who is interested in Russian studies, or in my case, Russian studies in an area like missile defense?
So I think I'm going to turn to the panelists now and have them comment on these, and all of them, some of them. We have 5 minutes, so we will end on time, so that'll be great.
Thanks. Obviously, we all need a lot more time to keep the discussion going. I think on Jason's question about jobs, I mean, the interesting thing about these cuts is that they affect the supply side and the demand side of the equation sort of simultaneously, which really gets us to some big sort of philosophical debates we're having in the country right now. I'm old-fashioned. I was taught in economics back in undergrad days that there were things called market failures, and those required the provision of public goods by somebody else. And then there was the market, which was efficient in all the other spheres. What's strange these days is the debate seems to have lost track of that. The goal is to actually decide whether you've got a market failure or whether you don't need intervention, as opposed to thinking the market is always right or the public space should always intervene and fix the market. So that's a much different conversation, but it's relevant here because until we get that philosophical divide to be breached in some way, to be overcome in some way, we're not going to be able to make progress on area studies or any other matter of public policy. So, it's a call for civility, really. On Blair's point about the change since the last 10 years, I think that's right. We need to be much more entrepreneurial. I think it's happening at public universities these days. All we ever talk about is being entrepreneurial and figuring out how to get our students to understand that they're going to have to make it in a different way. So I come back to Angela's very, very useful formula, which is that area expertise is a necessary but not sufficient condition for success, either as an expert or as a person who gets a job. But that's very important because if it is a necessary condition and nobody has it, we have a real problem. How to combat the EDD, empathy deficit disorder, this is one of the takeaways from our conference today for sure. It is about mindsets, as several people have said, Mary more recently. And students, it's true, come to the university thinking globalization gives them opportunity to change the world easily. I meet 18-year-olds at William & Mary all the time who say, next year I want to go solve the problem with the Ganges River Delta, shrimp farming. I'm going to go next year. Professor Hansen, can you help me get that set up? But then they go. And the great thing is because they go to the rest of the world, then they come back and say, whoa, in just those terms. We just learned that this is really not as simple as we thought. So my view is as long as people are going out to the world, they're going to learn the cultural complexities anyway. And so that's how we combat empathy deficit disorder. Is study abroad. A lot of it is study abroad. And other forms of foreign engagement. I guess the last point about I said about globalization, so I'll stop there.
I'll talk about interest at an earlier age. It is tricky. We're getting great traction with Chinese in unbelievable interest in developing dual language immersion that's articulated all the way up, get students engaged in Chinese. And it's easier to do because people understand, parents understand Chinese more. It's more difficult to do it with Russian. We do have some Russian K12 programs. University of Wisconsin-Madison is bringing underprivileged youth from Chicago and New Jersey up for summer institutes to get them really excited about learning Russian. I think, that kind of outreach is invaluable because it really gives students who might not otherwise think about international topics or language a chance to really have an experience, if it's done well, to feel confident about themselves, good about themselves, realize this is something that I can engage in. And I think as the field confronts this challenge of area studies, funding competing with the access agenda, with opportunity for underserved populations, look at how can you reach out and make the case that there's a study of the Georgia system that shows that study abroad among minority populations increases GPA, completion rates, all of these things. International is a great component for the access agenda, and I think marrying that would be a very good idea.
Okay, thank you. I'll just briefly touch 2 points. So I agree completely on the question of how you increase or you get interest high school, it's great. I mean, the younger, the better. You know, I have one shining example. So we had someone who did our program. He was born in rural Mississippi. He managed to get himself a high school exchange program to St. Petersburg. He didn't speak a word of Russian then, you know, but he learned it, came back, was a Peace Corps volunteer in Georgia, is now in the State Department, rising up, and is obviously multilingual. So, you know, the more, and if if the language isn't taught in the high school, at least have teachers that encourage students to do this. And in fact, part of the Title VI program is that those universities are supposed to, and we do interact with K through 12 teachers. So I think that's the only way to do it. On the jobs question, I have a somewhat more optimistic view of this. I mean, the majority of our graduates find jobs in the field. Significant numbers of them work for the U.S. government. We have quite a few in the State Department, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, and in the intelligence agencies. And those that don't get government jobs, I mean, we have former students who are in consulting, NGOs. So I actually think there are a lot of jobs still in the field that may be a little harder to find, and there's certainly still, the government is still hiring, the U.S. government in this field.
Well, thank you very much. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in education. Let me just put one plug. Laura Ellison and I are talking about hosting a conference like this next year in Washington, D.C. that will focus exclusively on these issues of area studies and international education. So hopefully we will continue this conversation then. I want to thank my panelists for their very engaging presentations and for your participation. Please, I encourage you to continue speaking with them and us during the break. Now we have a coffee break, and then we will convene about 10 minutes for our last panel. Thank you very much.
Sounds like the Mr. Bush. Go to Georgetown, join the STEM.
Well, of course. So what else is new? Do you have a presentation? I mean, that you could email me on the basis of what you did for that or not?
I can email that to you. And,
That would be great.
I have
Let me
other
just.
things with more data.
Yeah, very nice to meet you. Right.
Looking forward to attending.
Okay, that's great.
Very much, Angela. This is very nice. Thank you.
Right. That's fine. I'm just going to give him a card.
I was just talking to Catherine.
We have that. Jason
We must have, yeah.